Hello, good evening, everyone. Good evening to those of you in Israel. Good afternoon to those in North America and Europe and elsewhere. My name is Paul Gross. I'm a senior fellow here at the Menachem Begin Heritage Center. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the latest in this webinar in our series of Begin Symposium webinars. I will be returning to moderate this session, but before I do that, I would like to introduce a great supporter of Israel and a great supporter of this series, Tova Kava. Tova is Tova Kava is a great friend of this whole project. She was originally born in Poland, the daughter of Holocaust survivors. She lived in Netanya, Israel with her family from 1956 to 1959 and has lived in Denver, Colorado most of the time since. Professionally, Tova practiced accounting as a CPA from 1977 to 1989. She sold residential real estate for several years and has served most recently as the administrative partner and overseen property management of a real estate investment company in Colorado. She served as voluntary aide to two different Colorado state representatives during the 1990s. She founded the Aspen Media Watch in 2001, an organization countering anti-Israel misinformation and bias in Aspen newspapers. And in addition, she's had several editorials published on the topics of the Holocaust, American elections, and Israel. Tova, I'll hand over to you.
Okay, so welcome to everyone. My name is Tova, and I'm from Denver, as you just heard. With my background as a second-generation survivor, to me, Menachem Begin, the Holocaust survivor who spent time in a Siberian prison, as did my own father, is the most relatable of all Israeli prime ministers to date. His work at virtually forcing the British presence out of the Palestinian Mandate, and later his initiation of the bombing of the nuclear reactor in Iraq, made his leadership key to the establishment of the State of Israel, and later to her survival. This webinar, along with all the webinars in our series, is recorded and available on our events landing page. The link to the landing page is provided in the chat box. We don't anticipate any technical issues, but if the webinar crashes, please use the link you've been provided to sign back on. The Hidden Light Institute was formed with the purpose of educating individuals about Jewish leaders and historical events through documentary films, webinars, and other programming. Our web series and forthcoming digital symposium focuses on the leadership of Menachem Begin and his impact to the Jewish world, both in Israel and the diaspora. We appreciate the support of leadership and contributors to these efforts and thank all of you for your attendance today. Please note that our May symposium in Jerusalem has been rescheduled as an online event on January 6th, coinciding with the 40th anniversary of the Operation Opera, the 1981 bombing of the Osirak nuclear reactor in Iraq. A live in-person event will be scheduled in Jerusalem for early 2022. We will keep you informed of the date once it's scheduled. Our online symposium will feature Israeli President Reuven Rivlin, award-winning author Yossi Klein Halevi, former member of the Knesset Michal Kotler-Wunsch, and Rabbi Meir Soloveitchik, who will be covering a variety of topics related to Begin's legacy and impact to the world. We're excited to be presenting to Minister Pina Tamano-Shata the 2021 Begin Symposium Israel Leadership Award at the June 6th online symposium. Throughout his life, Begin's ability to negotiate and resolve conflicts truly set him apart from other leaders. Today's webinar focus will be on Egypt, Israel, on the Egypt-Israel Treaty, and specifically about Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat. Please use the chat feature to pose questions to our presenters, and Paul Gross will utilize time at the end of the session to present the questions to our panelists. At this time, I'd like to introduce today's speakers, starting with Ed Husain. Mr. Hussein is a British writer and political advisor who's worked with leaders and governments across the world. He has held senior fellowships at think tanks in London and New York, including at the Council on Foreign Relations at the height of the Arab uprisings. While at the Council, his policy innovation memo led to the US-initiated creation of a Geneva-based global fund established to help counter terrorism. Hussein was a senior advisor to former Prime Minister Tony Blair, and from 2018 to 2021, he completed his doctoral studies. He was advisor to Tony Blair from 2018 to 2021. And he completed his doctoral studies on Western philosophy and Islam under the direction of the English philosopher Sir Roger Scruton. He's the author of The Islamist, written in 2007, The House of Islam, A Global History, written in 2018, and Among the Mosques, most currently, in 2021. Hussein's writing has been shortlisted for the George Orwell Prize. A regular contributor to The Spectator magazine, he's appeared on the BBC and CNN and has written for The Telegraph, The Times, The New York Times, The Guardian, and other publications. He's traveled to more than 40 countries. Professor Gerald Steinberg is founder and president of NGO Monitor and professor emeritus at Bar Ilan University, where he founded the program on conflict management and negotiation. One second. His research focuses on Middle East diplomacy and security, the politics of human rights and NGOs, and Israeli politics and arms control. He was awarded a prestigious Israel Science Foundation grant, served as team leader for the Israel at the Polls chapters on peace negotiations and Israel-American relations. Steinberg was a member of the advisory board of the Israel Law Review and is a member of the Israel Council of Foreign Affairs. He was appointed to the Israel Higher Education Council Committee on Public Policy and is an academic participant in the Inter-Parliamentary Coalition for Combating Anti-Semitism. Lastly, Steinberg has been a participating member representing Israel in the Halifax International Security Forum since 2014. And now I'm going to hand it back to Paul Gross.
Thank you very much, Tova. Thank you for those introductions and those that informative the information about our symposium. I'm delighted to be here with Gerald Steinberg and Ed Husain. Gerald is a friend and a colleague and someone I've learned a lot from in recent years. Ed Husain, we don't really know each other, but I think our paths have crossed once or twice. And actually, your first book, The Islamist, made a big impression on me many years ago when you wrote it. I look forward to reading your latest book, Among the Mosques. Let's start with a look back at Camp David, 1978. Obviously, a lot of Gerald. I'll turn to you first, and a lot has been and had been written about Camp David and the Israel-Egypt peace process before you embarked on the project of writing your book, Menachem Begin and the Israel-Egypt peace process. There you go. Thank you. And a book which we actually launched here at the Begin Center in the days when we were able to have events at the Begin Center. And the big chidush, as they say in Israel, the big new idea of the book, the big novelty, was that it really highlighted, emphasized the absolutely critical role that Menachem Begin himself played in the peace process and the success of the peace talks, and I think also demolished a lot of the myths that had grown up around both Begin's conduct and some of the negative things that were said about Begin, and also the shall we say building up of President Jimmy Carter's role at the expense of both Begin and Sadat. So can you, Gerald, talk a little bit about the sort of thesis of the book and Begin's, the importance of Begin's leadership in that peace process?
Thank you. Thank you, Tova. Thank you, Paul. Thanks to the Hidden Light Institute and the Begin Center. This is a great opportunity, and I'm also grateful to be able to sit maybe with Ed Husain, at least virtually, and all the accomplishments that Ed has had. It's interesting, Paul, you talked about the origin of the book, and I'll just make a couple of comments about that, and then I'll talk about exactly the issues of Begin's leadership in the whole process. When I first began to work on these kinds of issues, I teach international politics, and particularly international negotiations, diplomacy, peace processes. And I gave a talk and about a general one. And at the time, this was, I don't know how many years ago, probably at least 20 years ago. And Harry Horowitz and Yichel Kadisha were in the audience. And they said that we should talk to him about writing a book about Begin. And we had a number of conversations. This is even before the Begin Center was actually built. And what I learned was that I knew already, but I realized the importance of this. Menachem Begin never wrote a book. In fact, when he left office suddenly, he afterwards did not allow interviews. He didn't leave memoirs, and that left the field wide open. And in that vacuum, particularly the American narrative, the Jimmy Carter narrative, dozens of books and interviews, but also supplemented by Moshe Dayan's version that he was at the center and Ezra Weitzman's version that he was at the center. And when you read all of this, you realize how many contradictions there were. And so with perhaps not enough humility, I said, well, if Menachem Begin didn't write a book, then maybe I can write a book. And I set off. This was a much longer project than I had expected, by reading as much as I could get. And then my co-author, then I realized that I had to have a co-author, Ziv Rabinovich, joined me in reading all the articles that Begin had written, particularly between 1967, when he was a member of the cabinet during the war, and 1977, when he became prime minister, his speeches, the cables that were sent. And that's what I want to talk about, particularly in the entire negotiation process, where you really see Begin's leadership role sticking out, very much highlighted and emphasized. And that's very important, because if you're writing from Washington, if you're writing that Jimmy Carter and his aides are the heroes, you don't pay much attention to what Begin said or did. In fact, Begin was, as you said, often portrayed as the reluctant peacemaker. That's the language that was used, and that had to be dragged kicking and screaming. That's absolutely not what the documentary evidence showed. When Begin was elected in 1977, it was we call it in Hebrew a mapach. It was a revolution in Israeli politics, and it was considered the former leaders of Israel, the Labor Party, thought this was going to be a short interlude when they come back to power. The Americans didn't know anything about Begin except that he was a leader of the Jewish terrorist movement, the underground, before 1948, and they really misjudged and didn't understand him. But what you see from the documentation, from Begin's own words and actions, and interviewing everybody that we could possibly interview, was that this was the necessity for Israel of reaching a peace agreement with Egypt. The opportunity and the necessity was something he realized from day one. Begin had been involved in foreign policy. He was a member of the government between 1967 and 1971 during the 1967 war, and then the policy making that took place afterwards. He had a pretty strongly set of principles. Principle number one was we can reach an agreement with Egypt on the basis of a full peace treaty. He is strongly opposed and left the government over the Rogers Plan, which was a certain amount of Israeli withdrawal in exchange for some security arrangements. There were proposals then to go further than that and to reach a non-belligerency pact for further Israeli withdrawals. And Begin, already in the 1970s, said no. Peace, full peace, recognition, embassies, travel back and forth, all of those things, cultural arrangements, yes, then I'm willing to do. Now, people did not pay much attention to that because they had this image of Begin as a unreconstructed hawk who never compromised. And that was clearly, anybody who understood and followed Begin's policies and statements knew that wasn't the case. But at the same time, he had a red line, and the red line was no transfer of sovereignty for the areas that he called Judea and Samaria, the West Bank of what we call the West Bank geographically and politically, and the terminology has all sorts of meanings, and I don't want to get caught up in that. But for him, Judea and Samaria were not to be transferred to foreign rule. That was a strong position. It's an ideological position. This was the land of our fathers, and we are not going to transfer that to any other power. Palestinians can pursue autonomy, they can run their own lives, and Begin was a very strong liberal Democrat. Paul, you've written about this. We do not want to run Palestinians' day-to-day lives at all. At the same time, we do not want foreign powers that close to our lifeline, given the geography, and which he was very well aware of. One of the first things he did was to get briefed by all the people that were involved in the, I wouldn't even call them the negotiations, but the discussions, the transfer of messages, usually through second parties, through Ceausescu in Romania. It's very odd to be talking about this now, one of the images that we have, but Ceausescu of Romania was a place that the Egyptians had good relations with. So that went to visit, and Israel had an ambassador there and had the chief of, or the head of the civilian head of the foreign ministry, Shlomo Avineri, the CEO, went to be briefed on those meetings with the Egyptians. This was before the election when Rabin was the prime minister. And Begin, the first day, wanted to know everything about those discussions, as well as what the Americans did. So he met with the American ambassador, Sam Lewis, and then he met with all the people involved in Israel that he could find. And then he appointed, at the same time, Moshe Dayan to be his foreign minister. And when he appointed Moshe Dayan, the key issue was, we want a peace agreement with Egypt. That's what they agreed on. Begin said no further than autonomy for Judea and for the Palestinians, Israeli Arabs, he didn't call them Palestinians, but we want a peace agreement with Egypt. So this was from the very first moment, and by every possible Israeli documentation, Menachem Begin wanted to reach a peace agreement with Israel because it was with Egypt, because it was in Israel's highest level, highest priority interests. And that's the way he pursued it. So when Sadat gave his speech in the Egyptian parliament and he made feelers towards coming to Jerusalem, Begin immediately grabbed that with both arms. In the first discussions that they had before Sadat came, in the months before, we're talking about the fall of 1977, when first the head of the Mossad was sent to meet with Sadat's representative in Morocco, and then later on Dayan in a wig and getting dressed up and went out and met also with the Egyptian representative Tahumi. And they met and they discussed, and Begin transferred to Dayan. They decided on the red lines, what was acceptable, what was not. And they indicated, they transmitted the fact that all of Sinai, that land for peace. There were some issues that had to do with how do you draw the boundaries, but Begin and Dayan accepted the principle of land for peace, a full peace for full Israeli withdrawal. And that said to Sadat, this guy's serious. He's willing to make peace and he can deliver. And that's the second point that I want to make, the issue of delivery. There was a lot of opposition, fierce opposition. People who look now at the videos that were taken back in 78 and 79, and then later on at the withdrawals in particular, very violent demonstrations, riots really, against withdrawal from Sinai, from the civilian settlements in Sinai. Begin throughout the crises and the negotiations, and then in the final stages before that Camp David, it was Begin who made the decisions. Begin was not the reluctant peacemaker. He listened to the Israeli delegation. We have the transcripts, the cables that were sent. Begin chaired those meetings. There were 2 weeks of very intense discussions in order to reach an agreement with Sadat. Carter kept getting in the way. At the beginning, Carter wanted to bring in the Soviets and have a Geneva conference, and I'll finish in about 2 minutes. So Ed will present it from the Egyptian side. But Begin insisted, along with Sadat, they agreed the Soviets will only muddle things up. And no, we do not want Yasser Arafat and the PLO in the room. Let's deal with our bilateral issues first. Let's set the stage for a Palestinian agreement. And there was a lot of disagreement about that. Jimmy Carter wanted to impose a complete formula for what he thought would reach Middle East peace by imposing both a Soviet presence at Geneva and a big conference, and then even bringing in the Syrians, and then bringing in Palestinians and Arafat, and both Sadat and Begin said no. And there was leadership on both sides on that. I started to talk about the domestic resistance. When Begin came back from Camp David and the agreements had been reached, the skeleton, the framework agreements of Camp David, very, very fierce demonstrations, opposition, particularly from Begin's own constituency, from the Khairut faction, the people that he spent all those years fighting the British and then in the opposition with, who were members of his government, his closest colleagues, his cabinet. And a number of them were very, very opposed to any transfer of territory, any withdrawal, and said, oh, Sadat, he's like the other Arabs, he's not going to honor the agreement, he'll get the land back. And Begin said, no, this is the agreement I want to reach, and it will serve Israel's interests. He got very upset when they called him a traitor, and he said, me, a traitor? And they kept coming back. You see that in his statements. And again, the memoirs he didn't have, but in the transcripts and the things that he wrote and his speeches that he gave in various committees that we have texts of. All the way through the Knesset votes that took place after the final peace treaty was reached at the beginning of 1979, where again, he was portrayed as a reluctant peacemaker, and Carter thought he would pull back. Begin guided that process through the votes in the Knesset, knew that he had a majority, but he also had to really watch and suffer the fact that some of his closest colleagues and friends voted against the treaty. He did it not for his own political grandeur, but because it was a core priority for Israel and Israel's core interests to reach a peace agreement with the largest and the most important Arab country in the world after 31 years of bitter conflict, and this 1973 war was still very fresh, and the casualties and everything else that was going with it in both leaders' minds. Begin was able to deliver that, and that really highlighted his greatness. And it was a very important monument to the work that he did along with President Sadat.
Thank you very much, Gerald Steinberg. Before I turn to Ed, I just want to remind everyone that they can and should write questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. So we'll get to that at the end of the presentation. Ed, Gerald talked about Menachem Begin. His book makes very clear just how important it was that Israel had a leader like Menachem Begin at that crucial juncture. No less important, of course, was that Egypt had Anwar Sadat, and that was the partner that we in Israel were dealing with. And I'm sure you're aware that today, whenever Israelis bemoan the absence of a credible and serious partner on the Palestinian side, they'll always go to Sadat and say, where's the Palestinian Anwar Sadat? So can you give us some words of insight and wisdom about President Anwar Sadat?
That's a great question, Paul. And before I respond directly to your question, just to say it's a real honor to be here with Professor Steinberg, but also with you, Paul, and the great work that you've done here in our country and also in Israel over the years, and the Hidden Light Institute and the fantastic work. And thank you to everyone for making time. For Anwar Sadat, I think his journey was as tough as the journey that President Menachem Begin had been on. Obviously, Menachem Begin had come out of the Gulag, if I'm not mistaken, but it's the fact that while President Begin did not write a book, it's fair to say that Anwar Sadat did write a book, and he dedicates his book for peace. He says, "In love of peace." And the book is quite thick, as you can see. He went out of his way to explain his own thinking. And today, whenever I'm in Egypt, people talk of Anwar Sadat in similar terms, that where is the Sadat, not just for Egypt, but for the entire region. And President Sadat also had to deal with Yasser Arafat and learn how to ignore him. He also learned how to ignore President Bashar al-Assad's father, Hafiz al-Assad, who made many, many threats of complete isolation of Egypt if Egypt went ahead and made peace with Israel. And why did President Anwar Sadat go as far as he did in the 70s and against Palestinian opinion, against the opinion of his great friend and ally Hafiz al-Assad, but also undoing everything that President Hafiz Gamal Abdel Nasser, his predecessor in Egypt, had embedded. And I think there are several things. First, we don't have too much time, but I'll just take a few minutes to illustrate that this is a man who saw himself as a farmer, who saw himself as a man of faith, who spent time in Egypt's prisons, who led wars against Israel, who lamented the fact that he could not be in the 1948 war against Israel because he was in prison. But in those years in prison, something happened to him, and he writes about that extensively. He explains to us that his four heroes growing up before he reaches prison in the 40s, growing up in the 20s and 30s, were the following. Ataturk in Turkey, because he was a leader who led the war, who formed a nation state, who had a secular country. Secondly, Napoleon Bonaparte, because of his attempts to undo British rule in the 1815s or the 1810s. So he's a huge admirer of Napoleon Bonaparte and the way Bonaparte undid the French monarchy. Third, his big hero was Gandhi, because of the way Gandhi adopted peaceful means to undo the British. So you can see a common theme here: anti-monarchy, anti-British, war leaders. And I think that his fourth choice of leader is very instructive. And that fourth choice was Adolf Hitler. Sadat goes out of his way to praise Hitler, the way in which Hitler united his country, the way in which Hitler stood against the British, the way in which Adolf Hitler honored the military uniform and marched across Europe. So there was this fascination with Adolf Hitler. Now, how does a man harbor love for Hitler and for Gandhi simultaneously? And it was in his prison years, I think from 42 to about 48, that he contemplates his love for these great heroes in his life. And he starts to read the Quran obsessively in prison. Cell 56 he was in, and he reads the Quran obsessively in prison. That's the first point. The second point is he is given a copy of John Stuart Mill's On Liberty and Formation of Government and so on in prison. Third is that he writes excessively about the importance of love. While in prison, he discovers not just spirituality and the need for God, but also the need for love. And he mentions verses such as, if my servants ask about me, tell them that I am close by. He didn't believe in a distant and remote God, but a God that was close to him. And he comes out of prison and he spends many years, in the forefront of the revolution in Egypt in 52, 53, serving Gamal Abdel Nasser. But he realizes that there's something about the Soviets that the Egyptians cannot trust, but there's something about the Americans that the Egyptians can trust. That at the height of the Suez crisis, why was it that the Americans sided with the Egyptians, but against the Israelis, against the British, against the French? And that's a cognitive opening for Sadat. And as Professor Steinberg correctly identifies, he then increasingly moves towards making peace with Israel. But I'll end by saying this, that his outreach towards Israel was sincere. Yes, it was strategic. Yes, it was about moving closer to the Western camp, reassuring Henry Kissinger, making peace with a perceived enemy. But his spiritual understanding of Moses, of Egypt, of the Jewish people, of Israel was genuinely sincere. Many of the conversations with Menachem Begin and others were faith-based conversations. In other words, God was in the room. Even for Carter, God was in the room, that they had a familiarity with the Old Testament. So I think I'll end my remarks by saying that this is a man who's fascinating for one reason and one reason only: change. That change is a conservative characteristic, that he was a conservative who believed in conserving his people and conserving his region by changing. And he wrote extensively about the importance of change. And he goes against large swathes of Egyptian opinion, certainly large swathes of Arab opinion, in order to make peace with Israel and with President Menachem Begin. And when he goes to the Knesset famously and he speaks, he comes back. We often remember that there was one Islamist extremist who opened fire and killed him subsequently, but we forget that there were more than 5 million Egyptians that welcomed him home on the streets of Cairo. And he writes about that, and we still have the footage. That, I mean, I think it's hard today to imagine if, say, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia went to Jerusalem and came back. It's hard to imagine that you would have 5 million Saudis in the streets, but that's what we had. We had more than 5 million Egyptians welcoming the Egyptian president back into Egypt. So on that optimistic note, on remembering the importance of change and the importance of God, the soul, and strategic calculations, and the bonding of men and women on sincerity and courage, I think I'll hand over back to you, Paul.
Thank you very much, Ed. It's very interesting thinking about what you mentioned with Sadat's religious feeling and his knowledge of the Quran, his understanding of the religious connection with the Jews, and you said that you said God was in the room in the negotiations, because of course Menachem Begin was really Israel's first prime minister who would have been able to have that conversation with him. I think it's fair to say. Prior to Begin, it was a sort of a list of very, very secular, if not atheist, prime ministers, and Begin was this very traditional Jew. So that's also, I think, interesting and perhaps providential that
Yes.
that he was around for that. Let's go forward to where we are today, and I see actually that we're actually preempting a question that I know was going to be asked at the end of our presentation about the Abraham Accords, because we're now in a situation where Israel, in recent months, has signed these peace deals or normalization agreements with the UAE and Bahrain, and subsequently with Morocco and Sudan, and really leading to basically a changed Middle East in many ways. Maybe Ed, I'll ask you first. Looking at it maybe from the outside, as not someone based in the UK, obviously someone with very strong connections to the Middle East, but looking at it from Europe, how do you see these extraordinary developments, and what does it say to you about the possibility for the future?
Again, another great question, Paul. I think, to be completely candid, the Europeans had very little to do with any of this. The European Union as an organization is aghast, horrified, shocked that such a development ought to occur, because their modus operandi has been, you've got to have a two-state solution, you've got to talk with the Palestinians, and everything flows from that. And I think that assumption's been proven to be wrong I happened to be in the Bahrain conference where Jared Kushner was making the presentation that this is about economics, this is about changing the way in which it was done previously. And I remember in the room, there was a sense of electricity, that things can be different, that you can grip the problem, and you don't need to hold 400 million Arabs hostage to the qualms of 4 million Palestinians between the West Bank and Gaza. So that was a breath of fresh air. But I think what's absolutely vital here is that what comes out of the White House does have a direct impact on the lives of ordinary Palestinians, but also securing Israel. And having been in Bahrain and the UAE and had conversations with friends in government on multiple occasions, they are threatened by three things, and Israel is aligned with them on those three things. One is the threat from Iran, which is a real threat, both the nuclear threat, but also Iran's support for Hamas and for a whole host of Hezbollah aligned organizations. It's a real threat for them and for Israel. So that's a genuine alignment. Second is the Muslim Brotherhood, which threatens their stability and threatens the stability of Egypt and Morocco and Sudan and the UAE and Saudi Arabia. And third is the threat that comes from the European left. And I say that as someone who's served Tony Blair and the Labour Party and elsewhere, that there is a faction of the European left that does not want to see Israel thrive as a democracy in the region. They would much rather see Israel part of a one nation arrangement where Israel's religious identity is obliterated. And I think those three threats unite the forward-looking Arab countries. Now, I'll end this answer by saying where we were this time last year was that the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan were the four pioneers, but we were firmly convinced that Saudi Arabia and a host of others will join, maybe not the Abraham Accords, but maybe the Isaac Accords, or maybe the Rebecca Accords, or maybe the Ishmael Accords, or maybe just the normalization arrangement, that something was in the offing. But the combination of paralysis in Jerusalem with the government formation, but the discouragement issued by the White House and the inability of the State Department spokesperson even to use the phrase Abraham Accords, the fear of having God in the room, the kowtowing to the George Soros narrative that, do away with identity, do away with God, do away with the notion of Israel. And what we want to create is some kind of secular country where Palestinians, ultimately overtake the Jewish presence. What we don't have is an Israeli Jewish state. And I think all of those issues coming to the forefront makes it very difficult to say that, Iran is not being bolstered. So I think our side is taking a big hit in all of this, and it's on our side to reassure our friends in the UAE, in Bahrain, in Sudan, in Morocco, in Washington, D.C., and indeed in Jerusalem, that what we have must be retained, and truth and the strength of the truth will ultimately prevail.
Thank you very much for that positive approach. Gerald, can you address the current situation?
Well, that was fascinating to hear Ed present his analysis. I found myself, you may have seen me nodding my head in agreement. There are a couple of points I want to pull out of that because I think they're extremely important. First of all, it's important in this setting to recall that this is being built on the treaty between Israel and Egypt, that Begin and Sadat negotiated back in 1979, 42 years. That's the amazing thing. Ed, you mentioned the fact that one of Sadat's early heroes was Hitler, and that Israelis, many of them said, how can you even trust someone who has that background? And Begin said all the things that he said, and he turned out to be absolutely right, that this treaty has been the anchor of stability, of sanity in the Middle East. And now we're seeing more countries building on that. And that's extremely important. That was the critical foundation. It's important for Israelis to see that there's more than just the agreement with Egypt, which, let's be honest, is a cold peace. There's a lot of opposition to it. And some of it stems from within the Middle East, Muslim Brotherhood, ideological fanatics, but also the Europeans are contributing to that. Europe doesn't care at all about fostering the connections, people to people and government to government, and common interest between Israelis and Egyptians, or Israelis and Bahrainis, or people, I don't know how you say, emirate citizens, and beyond that. And so this gives us a big boost that yes, peace is not just possible, but it's something within our grasp if we can find enough of common interests and work together. And that's extremely important. The other point that I want to make is the fact that Israel is now more and more considered to be part of the Middle East. And Israelis start to understand that we're not some sort of piece of not Europe. Europe's not my best, they're not our best friends, but in any case, we're not this piece of Europe that somehow got caught in the wrong area. We're really part of the Middle East, and we can go out and travel. And the idea that Israelis, first of all, immediately, even with Corona, flocked when the planes were open to go out and go see these places and be part of it. And there's more and more that I have conversations on virtual conversations, Zoom conversations and others with academic colleagues in these countries, and finding ways that we can work together on a host of issues. In the medical field, I won't go through all the things, but one of the things that struck me was Israel has a lot of capabilities in the medical field, and there's a very high level of science and technology, for instance, in the UAE. And there was a recent agreement that Israeli experience in dealing with diabetes and treating diabetes is something that now we're working together with the UAE counterparts. There's many of these, and they happen all the time. And this is the glue that gets us away from they're going to blow us up, they're going to kill us, to we can work together with them, even if there's still the threat of Iran and other fanatics who don't want this to happen. So building on the experience with Egypt and adding to that everything that we have, I think this is it's a tremendous step in the right direction, and something I think that both Begin and Sadat would be very proud that this is an essential part of their legacies and their successes.
Thank you very much. Before I go to questions, Ed, I just wanted to ask you, as I said at the beginning, I recall reading your very first book, The Islamist, which I recommend to everyone watching this, and for those that don't know, recounts Ed's younger days as a radical, as his radical Islamist, and before he became very much working in counter-extremism and fighting against extremism in Islam. Can you tell us something, just briefly, just because while it would be a shame, I think it'd be a waste to have you on this in this meeting and not ask you this, to share something of what it was like to sort of to leave behind this ideology, which I'm sure said all kinds of things about Jews and Israel, which you now, of course, reject. How did you come to see that very toxic talk about Jews and Israel as something that you ultimately had to reject and fight against?
You put your finger on the pulse of the issue. You know, lots of people claim to be in a position of rejecting the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas's narrative, you know, on say, you know, we must overthrow every Muslim government, we must be against the West, but don't really probe the Israel and the Jewish question. And I think for me, even after I'd left the Islamist organizations, even after I wrote a book called The Islamist that you kindly mentioned, I mean, there was still something in my mind. And I see that now, even with friends in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere, and indeed Egypt, that, you know, they would tick every liberal box, you know, pro-LGBTQ, you know, you name it, every box, but mention Israel and they're silent, you know. For me, that was the last and the most important mental block I had to overcome. And I owe it to a friend of mine, and some of you may know, Jonathan Feldman. I remember being on a CNN program out of New York, having a big fight with Naftali Bennett in 2013-14. And Jonty said, you know, how can you claim to be a moderate Muslim when you're fighting Naftali Bennett, when Bennett was supporting taking out of Hamas operatives in Gaza? And I couldn't reconcile that. So Jonty said to me, come out with me to Israel. If you're sincere, you know, go and meet people. And when I was out there, I had the good fortune of meeting Rabbi Moshe Weiss. And in Jerusalem, he took me into his home, allowed me to meet his mom, his daughters, took me into a yeshiva. And it was that experience of meeting real Israelis not just kind of meeting with left-leaning activists here who are in disagreement with Israel that suited my narrative, saying, oh, look, but Natarai Kata here are, Jewish people, but they also oppose the state of Israel. So why am I wrong? So it was just, really kicking tires in Israel, getting a feel for the country. On the night of Ramadan, hearing the call to prayer, the fireworks going off, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in the morning, and then being at the Kotel in the evening, seeing that secular coexistence of people of all faiths, it does something to you. So it was really, John T. and Rabbi Weiss who changed my mind. And then since then, I'd written extensively. I don't want to claim I was the first mover. I was not. Clearly, it was President Sadat who was the first mover here. But I remember writing for the New York Times, I think in 2013, 2012, about the need for today's Arabs to follow that leadership. And then, getting notes from people in the UAE and other countries saying this makes sense. And I just didn't believe them. But it took many years, and this is the point that I want to make, that yes, for me personally, moving from hating Israel to understanding Israel and God's people, and that claim to land, those laws, those liberties, that language, and that land is particular. And Europe might have a difficulty in accepting that today. But that was my personal journey. And I think what we're seeing is what President Sadat went through. He was a person who started off with admiration for Adolf Hitler to where he ended up. And that's why I would say to people on the call and to people more broadly is that never give up in the power of change and belief that real interaction, real friendship. It was my love for John T. and him opening my eyes that led to my being then able to influence and have conversations with people in other countries that led to change. So similarly, John T always says to me, small acorns, never go big and imagine that you're going to change the world. Start with a small thing. So, Gerald spoke about academic friendships. And I think for people on the call, it's influencing that 1, 2, 3 individuals that go on to make real change. And I'm seeing that now, in the region. And I think we will see that in other parts of the world. So change for me isn't just a slogan. I've lived that life and I see that. President Sadat was born on Christmas Day. I was born on Christmas Day. I've always had this affiliation with Sadat, and I genuinely believe change can happen and it can change people's hearts. And ultimately, and I'll end by this point, is that we have 6,000 years of truth on our side. We have the narrative of Jacob, of Isaac, of before them Moses, and after them Moses rather, and before them Joseph, and all the prophets, and that we should never shy away from that godly divine truth from the Old Testament to the New Testament's continuity in Jesus, to the Quran and Muhammad, constantly referencing those prophets. I'm not in any way shying away from some of the difficult moments, in Muhammad's life, especially in Medina, but we shouldn't let that steer us away from the many, many, many positive narratives. And the fact that Maimonides spent time in Egypt, the fact that we don't have a Holocaust on the side of the Muslim history and Arab history. Bernard Lewis would often talk about that fact. The Europeans have a dark history, that Muslims may have glitches, but we don't have that systematic, organized dislike. And nor do we say that Jewish people killed our God. We just don't have that problem. It's not in our DNA. And Arabs and Jews and Muslims and Jewish people and Israelis should be able to get along much better without the dark history that Europeans, have had over the last 70, 100 years or longer, in fact.
Amen to that. Thank you very much, Ed. Okay, I'm gonna go to a question that we've had here specifically about Iran and the threat of Iran to Israel and those who are making peace with Israel. So we think about perhaps the role that that Iranian threat is playing in the push towards the alliance of Israel and I guess especially the Gulf states. Gerald, do you want to take that on first? You're muted. Gerald, you're muted.
I'm now unmuted.
Oh,
okay.
There.
I try to keep it quiet when I'm not speaking. I'm not sure how to do that in a couple of minutes. It's such a huge question. Iran is the last remnant in many ways of the Iranian complex with Hezbollah and to some degree what's left of the Syrian regime, Assad and others, of the wipe Israel off the map ideology commitment that goes back many decades. And they're serious about it. And Israelis have learned to take it seriously, but their view is also to impose whether it's their version of Islam or whether it's their hegemony in terms of oil and over the Gulf states. Iran really is the major source of instability for all of the countries in the region that are not part of that, the Iranian network. And it's a serious threat because we see on a regular basis, whether it's the deployment of the various Revolutionary Guard groups, Quds factions, different groups, Hezbollah, as I said, and others, the Houthis in Yemen, which are also the same kind of instability that we see in other places. And that's a common language that we all see that threat is very real. That the interest of survival against that threat is something that's present, and we have a common language and ways to cooperate on that. I think that's an important part of the glue. I don't think it's the only important part of the glue. I mentioned the cooperation. The fact that Ed, you talked about not allowing Palestinians with their, I forgot the word that you used, but their, I would say their complex of driving everybody out and controlling everybody's agenda and being completely unwilling to meet anybody halfway or to reach agreements. And that's something also that there's a common understanding that we have to get beyond that for the good of all of our societies. So Iran is in many ways the catalyst. The threat from Iran is a catalyst. I'm just going to make one other quick comment going back to 1977 and Begin and Sadat. Jimmy Carter wanted to bring in the Soviet Union at first, and then, as I said, in Arafat into this grand peace process. Now, I'm not sure how far the Biden administration is going to go, but certainly in terms of the approach that has been taken with respect to Iran back in the days of Obama and many of the people involved in Washington now, to reach an accommodation with Iran, because that way they will be brought in to the countries that one can do deals with, and it will bring in stability. Those of us in the region, those of us who have to deal with Iran on a regular basis, know that's just not something that's on the agenda. They didn't do it after the JCPO, the nuclear agreement back in 2015, and they're not going to do it now. It's the same people. So that's something also that in my conversations with people in the Gulf who do security, you see exactly the same types of concerns.
Thank you. Ed, do you want to add something to that about Iran?
Very briefly, and that's to say, yes, Iran's a threat, and yes, Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu's leadership in the last decade or so, going against the Obama administration. I mean, that's something that inspired people in Riyadh, in Abu Dhabi, and Cairo and elsewhere. There's no doubt about that. But there is something that I just want to relay. Something that my Saudi friends often say, that the warming of relations between Israel and the Gulf Arabs isn't only about Iran, although that was the key catalyst. Gerald is absolutely right. But they look to Israel and they see a nation that's been built out of the desert. They look to Israel and they see its advances on agriculture, on finance, on science, on healthcare, and they want a big slice of that. They want to invest in Israel, and they want to do that now via Bahrain and the UAE, and all kinds of funds are being set up. So I think while, yes, Iran was the catalyst and remains a problem, we've reached a psychological stage now where people have transcended the Iran issue and see Israel as firmly part of the region and want to now work with Israel and just want to get over that narrative of 67 and 48 and 73 and look to the future. And by the way, there's a new generation now, and private polling done by the Saudis has meted this out on more than 3 occasions. The new generation, the 16, 18, 25, even 29, 30-year-old, which is the vast majority of the Saudi population by the year 2030, just don't care about the old narratives and just look at Israelis and Jewish people and think, yeah, fine, great, they're part of the region. So what's next? The old narrative of boycott and divestment and supporting Hamas and all that's now gone. It's just it's for the Muslim Brotherhood leadership lingering in prison narrative. So I think all of that is positive and welcome.
Great, thank you very much. There's a question here from Michael Reich, who asks about, he wonders whether the Abraham Accords make a difference to the type of peace between Egypt and Israel, and maybe whether, I think he's asking maybe whether the example of the much warmer peace that seems to be burgeoning between Israel and the Gulf states, could actually influence the Egypt-Israel peace agreement? I don't know who wants to take that on.
Ed, do you want to go first, or you want me to go first?
Just a quick anecdote, if I may.
Sure.
A friend from the Egyptian government, about just before COVID hit us really hard, there was real bitterness on the part of the Egyptian government that why is it that we have Sharm el-Sheikh, we have a closer border with the Israelis, we've got a longer peace with the Israelis. Why is it that so many Israelis are now going to Dubai and want to go to the Gulf, come to us? And the answer is because the Emiratis have welcomed the Israelis with open arms, set up kosher kitchens, set up direct flights, and openly invited Israelis, and are not embarrassed of this relationship. It's not a secret affair. It's an open marriage. And so there was conversation among the Egyptians as to how they could have a similarly open, warm relationship. And I think if COVID passes, and inshallah, touch wood, it will, that we will see genuine overtures from the Egyptians to want to do that. And forgive me for a quick anecdote, Rabbi Maimonides' great synagogue is still there in Cairo. And there are genuine conversations as to how that can be a center to draw attention of the Jewish world that here is Maimonides' synagogue here in Cairo. Please come and see this here in Egypt. The Emiratis and the Bahrainis and the Saudis don't have this. So I think that's a good competition to be having, who can draw Israeli and Jewish traffic and open up those, warm touristic relationships. So there is a desire to change the cold peace to a warm peace.
I'll just add my own anecdote to what Ed said. I first went to Egypt I'm trying to remember the exact year. It was probably right after the Gulf War, so it was in the early 90s, maybe 92 or 93, and I was invited to a series of academic conferences. I must have been there 5 times, back and forth. And yes, there's a cold peace. It was the era of Mubarak, and very low level. We were relatively low level. It wasn't widely advertised, but it wasn't underground. We met at the Al Ahram Center, with a lot of people were invited, and did some other activities, which again were not strictly secret, but that the personal friendships that grew up, and the thirst for understanding details of Israeli history, of Jewish history, and vice versa, from my colleagues' parts. That sense of excitement is something now we're feeling in the Gulf, and the realization that we can go beyond the small things. So everything that Ed said is, I just want to reemphasize that. That's exactly, Israelis have a sense of excitement. It would have been more if we didn't have the COVID clampdowns to deal with, but now that we're getting out of that, that's going to be a big deal. And I hope, and I believe that that's true, that we'll be able to go in both directions. We'll be able to go out over the to the east and south to the Gulf, and we'll be and also to Egypt, and then beyond there to Morocco. A lot of this has been going on again quietly. In Morocco, there's been a lot of tourism going on, but we always have to go first through someplace in Europe. Very rarely were the direct flights. Maybe there were never any direct tourist flights. Now that's a real possibility. I think that's already happening.
Great. So we have a couple more questions. Maybe we'll finish with these. There's a question here about whether the Abraham Accords, or how the Abraham Accords affected the status of Israeli Arabs, and whether they could maybe be a bridge between Israel and the Arab world. Just a reminder for those of you watching who don't know, obviously 20% of Israel's population, of Israel's citizens, are Arab, the vast majority of whom are Muslim. Some, I think 90% of that, 20% are Muslim. Ed, I'm not sure how au fait you are with the intricacies of Israeli of domestic Israeli sociological or political issues, but if you have anything you want to add on that, or your own experiences perhaps with Israeli Arabs, then we'd be very happy to hear that.
Only just to say that the ordinary Israeli Arab is different from the Palestinian leadership, whether that leadership is Hamas or Fatah or anyone else. Ordinary Israeli Arabs prefer to stay and live in Israel rather than move to either Gaza or the West Bank if given the opportunity. And there's a reason for that. And that's just based on conversations and encounters I've had. And Palestinians who are living in the UAE, Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia have been very vocal in the support for the Abrahamic cause. Now you can do your mathematics and say, well, they have to, don't they, because they're living in those countries. But not really. They can quietly not express support, but they did. And the last point I'd make on this is that 30% of women from an Arab background in Israel are unemployed. Vast numbers of people from an Arab background in Israel want access to capital, want to be recognized, want to have dignity, want to do well, and they've been held back by the Palestinian leadership. So this gives them an opportunity to just access capital, resources, recognition, dignity, jobs, bypassing their corrupt leadership, which incidentally is wealthy and has benefited from its own kind of receipt of Western and other aid, and work directly with the Palestinian, directly with the Arab populations. And from what I hear from friends in Dubai, when they're in Israel and when they're in Jerusalem, they are booking hotels both in the Israeli side as well as the Arab side. They're taking taxis from both sides. So there's a genuine desire on the side of Arabs to want to help Israeli Arabs, and that can only be a good thing. And I think any other reading of that is politicized, confrontational, and wants to subvert Israel. And I don't think that's in the good interests of either the Arabs or the Israelis, or indeed the Palestinian populations in West Bank and Gaza or elsewhere.
Thank you very much.
Everything that I find myself always agreeing with Ed, which is a great thing to do, and adding a little bit of an anecdote in my own experience. So in my classes a year ago, when we had classes and not by Zoom, and there at Bar Ilan, which is a religious framework university, it's considered, I think, sometimes very simplistically and falsely to be a right-wing university. I don't think that's very accurate. But it's a traditional, it has a traditional element. A lot of Israeli Jews prefer Bar Ilan, and we have a population, a student body that is somewhat more or less reflects the 20% of both of Israeli Arab citizens, some Muslims, some Christian, Druze, and others. So we have a broad cross-section. In many of my classes, I can't tell the difference. Sometimes by the names. Sometimes there are 200 people in the class. I don't know the names anyway. The dress, the camaraderie, the social interaction. But what the Abraham Accords did was it opened the doors, not just for Israeli Jew students, but Israeli Arab students, that they don't have to feel isolated and always carrying the burden of the identity, the split identity, the conflict with them. Because here, and we see now, just as Israeli Jews and Arabs are going to Bahrain, are going to the UAE, other places, the planes are full in both directions. And that means that this isolation that Israelis have imposed on themselves for each part of the society in somewhat different ways for 70 plus years, it's really beginning to melt. And that also is a source of optimism.
Thank you very much. If I may add, just to back up what both of you were saying, there was an interesting poll finding of, I think it was last week, that I think some 70% of Israeli Arabs, that's Israeli Arab citizens of Israel, see themselves as Israeli, not Palestinian.
Yes.
And which is very interesting and really kind of flies in the face of a lot of the rhetoric that you hear from political leaders on the Arab side, that the actual of the population, the Arab population of Israel, 20% in Israel, the majority of them actually want to be part of this state and want to be part of the Israeli state and see themselves in that way. Final question. This is I guess this is really for you, Gerald, but I'd be happy to hear anything from Ed as well. It's a question about Jimmy Carter, and the question is, how do you account for Carter's present, I'm reading it as it's written, anti-Israel / pro-Palestinian attitude now versus 1977-78?
I don't think anything has changed. That Carter has always had a very distant, alienated and alienating relationship with Israel. Ken Stein, who was is Professor Kenneth Stein from Emory University, who has written also about the negotiations and about the heroic diplomacy is the name of his book, which is about all of the peace efforts. And there's a good chapter in there on Begin and Sadat. And Ken Stein said he was an aide to, or I've forgotten what his job was at the university. There's a Carter Library, and he did work with Carter, and he resigned. And he refers to Carter as an anti-Semite. And maybe one can argue on religious grounds or on other grounds that Carter never really was interested in understanding Israel, what made not just Begin, but Israel as a society. And if you look at the way Carter spoke and reacted in a very also condescending way, in my view, both to Begin and Sadat, he tried to manipulate in a very, again, a condescending way. He had big psychological profiles. Instead of dealing with the substance, he tried to play psychological games, both at Camp David and afterwards. And I think that also is although he presents a liberal progressive image, behind that is this type of attitude of dismissing both the Israeli leadership and the Egyptian leadership as part of that drive to impose his own views throughout the peace process. The negotiations took 2 years, roughly, actually a year and a half, from the time that Sadat landed in Jerusalem till the signing of the peace treaty. And in between was Camp David. I would say that many months of that process were taken up and really wasted because Carter wanted to impose a Palestinian state, an agreement, they called it a Palestinian homeland. And because he wanted, for other things that he tried to do, which was just not on the table. Instead of agreeing to accept and encouraging, which he finally did at the end, the two leaders, so that in providing the security guarantees and the other and economic assistance so that the agreement could be signed, Carter was really acting as a crowbar trying to divide them. At Camp David, one of the first things Carter did was he separated Sadat and Begin and tried to avoid having meetings in which the two of them would participate. Yes, there were a lot of intense disagreements, but those were disagreements on principle that the two leaders understood they needed to overcome. And Carter tried to make himself the center of the negotiation process. And that failed. And it was only after that ended that the two sides were able to sit down and say, okay, what are we going to give up? How is it going to work so that we can reach an agreement that will serve our interests and serve the interests of peace? So in many ways, I think Carter's very problematic personality in this. And that was something that was recognized by both leaders.
Thank you. And I don't know if you had particular views on President Carter. I wondered if, with your permission, if I can adjust the question a little so that we could maybe get the best benefit of having you on this call, and say, you already mentioned, you've referred to Europe and the EU, and also this sort of tendency on the European left with regard to Israel. And it strikes me that what Gerald's mentioned with regard to Jimmy Carter, I think, applies in a very similar way to many so-called progressives and liberals in Europe, in European politics and elsewhere. Can you speak to that a little? Can you maybe just give us some of your thoughts on that tendency in Europe, in Britain? Obviously, we know about the not the previous leader of the Labour Party. But can you say something about that, and maybe your sort of sense of where that's coming from in the European scene?
Yeah, that's a deep question, and it's a great question, Paul.
Sorry to end on that.
No, but I think it's a very important issue because it's on the rise. There's a reason why so many Jewish people from France are now here in the UK. There's a rise in anti-Semitism in France, similarly in parts of Germany, in Austria, and elsewhere. And it's not just the European left. The European left feels emboldened because they've now got backup through large numbers of Muslims in those countries, and the feeling somehow in their minds is, Muslims Arabs, therefore must be anti-Jewish, therefore must be anti-Israel. And if we, i.e. Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party here, can have some kind of alliance with these quote unquote Muslims, then we would have more people supporting our party and we have a higher chance of success in elections. It's a very naked, ugly political calculation that's backed up by anti-Semitism, that's backed up by a disregard for the likes of Clement Attlee and others that were hugely supportive of Israel. It's also backed up by an expectation that Israel should really be this Jewish underdog that's full of kibbutzes, that's somehow supportive of the international left. How dare it be a nuclear power? How dare it be so strong? How dare it have a prime minister like Menachem Begin and others who are on the center-right? And how dare it be such a close ally of the Americans and be a broadly capitalist nation? All of those things are evil and wrong. And therefore, we must be on the side of these oppressed Muslims who have arrived on the continent, who are in much larger numbers. And if we just support them against Israel, not only will we undo the Israeli strength, but also Jeremy Corbyn and others will have huge political success and electoral success. Now, that's wrong on two counts, because large numbers of Muslims are not anti-Israeli, are not anti-Jewish. And as we've seen here, there haven't been any protests against the Abraham Accords. Large numbers of Muslims are, oh, that's great news. We have friendship with our Jewish and Israeli friends. We saw that when a gentleman was openly on the London Underground 2 years ago attacking a young Jewish child and a family. It was a Muslim woman in a headscarf and others that intervened. So there are many, many examples of Jewish and Muslim people, much more closely aligned than the godless hard left of Europe. So I think what's often misunderstood among the European left is that many Muslims are much closer to Jewish people in faith, but also in identity and the reading of history, from the book of Exodus onwards. So that is often misunderstood. So the European left, I can go on and on, but I don't want to, but I want to end by saying that if we understand that Jewish people and Muslim people have a common reading of history, the same belief in the one God, the same belief in trying to uphold yes, we have disagreement on some elements of the laws, but many of the Muslim laws are taken directly from the Old Testament, but also our place in the world as creation of God, and we have a responsibility to make the world a better place. And these are called Abrahamic Accords for a reason, Paul, that we have a common father in Abraham. Yes, we're descendants of Ishmael, and yes, you're descendants of Isaac, but we all believe in the same one God, and we all believe in making the world a better place. Now, the European left has a different version of what that world should look like. The Prophet Muhammad was a capitalist. He was a businessman. They don't like to talk about the fact that Islam is a capitalist trading religion. Now, the more we can open up that schism and identify the common narrative between the children of Abraham, the more I think we isolate those who believe in that George Soros Hungarian leftover from the 1940s worldview that does not want to identify religion and public identity as religiosity and Israel's right to remain a Jewish state. All of those issues are really ones that we should be identifying. And unless we do that, my fear is the likes of AOC and the likes of Ilhan Omar, they will win over time. But we still have the vast majority of the people on our side. We still have the vast majority of the electorate on our side. And the more vocal we are in identifying what that far left worldview means for the West, for the UK, and for Israel, I think we have a much greater chance of continuing to make more gains and winning, for our side of the debate.
Thank you very much, Ed. I said those are the last questions. There is one last question that I want to just ask and get a very brief answer from both of you, just because it's late in the day, but I do want to get this question out there because it's very current and it's asked by one of our audience. How does the current, now that we have a new US administration, how does the current US administration, the Biden administration, affect the Abraham Accords? That's the question as written. Gerald.
It's early days. The Biden administration is very busy with its internal issues. It's just understandable. And I think it's too early to tell. They have not ripped up the accords. They have not acted against them. I also suspect that there are internal differences about what to do about this, because it is, in a certain sense, perceived as an anti-Iran alliance. You want to reach an agreement with Iran, you might have to, then you could argue to push back. I don't think that's going to happen. I think that there are enough sensible people I think Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, and Biden himself are not going to be bashing their heads against the wall, but to use a different cliche, go with the flow. These agreements exist. They are successful. They are important. How foolish would it be for us as a democratic liberal administration to throw these out the window just because Trump was involved in this, just because Netanyahu was involved in this, just because there are parts of the regimes that we don't agree with, and that's fine. So I'm optimistic, but I might also be naively optimistic.
Okay, thank you.
You asked for a short answer. I'll leave it at that.
That was great. That was great. Ed?
No, I agree with everything Gerald said. I also think that President Biden and Secretary of State Blinken and others, the grown-ups in the room, will prevail. One of the reasons why the UAE and other countries did this, it was seen as a hedge in order to say to the Democrats that, look, we too are pro-Israel. And one of the reasons why the Saudis did not come into the Abraham Accords, it was there where you're saying, well, look, President Trump got his moment in the sun with Arab leaders. We will be the leaders who sign a peace deal with Israel with President Biden. So that's something we shouldn't dismiss. That's something that's real and on the table, that multiple nations would want to come and say to President Biden that you want to be in the sun and you want to be making peace with Israel and undo this conflict. Well, here are 4 or 5 other nations that want to work with you. And I think that's what we should be focused on. Don't call it the Abraham Accords, call it the Isaac Accords, the Ishmael Accords, whatever you want, but get 4 or 5 nations that are making peace with Israel and give Biden his moment in the sun, so he doesn't feel as though this was a Trump initiative. Because, to be fair, it was not a Trump initiative. Trump was there at the right time, supportive of it, but there have been conversations going on between Ambassador Ron Dermer and others along those lines for more than 8 to 9 years. And as we've identified, I think the first movers were President Sadat and Prime Minister Menachem Begin.
Okay, thank you very much, Ed, for those final thoughts. Thank you, Gerald. I want to just say, firstly, Gerald, one of our audience has written in the chat to thank you for defending Israel on the BBC Today program against the
I was
apartheid.
defending human rights and moral principles.
Fair enough.
Israel, but...
Fair enough. Against the apartheid slur of our friends at Human Rights Watch. And I want to thank you both again. I want to thank everyone for joining us. There is a link in the chat box to more information about the symposium, virtual symposium on June 6th. That will also be advertising that at various places, publicizing it on social media and elsewhere, and on the Facebook page and the website of the Menachem Begin Heritage Center. You can also email me, paulg@begincenter.org.il. For more information, and we look forward to seeing you on more of these webinars. Thank you all. I wish you all a good day, a good evening, and Ed and any other Muslim members in our audience, a Ramadan Kareem, and thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.